Hello and welcome back to my channel. If you're new, my name is Gene Curl and this is the ninth part of my story because so much has happened in my life that I couldn't get it all in one video and because I'm long-winded. Anyhow, because this video is late in my story, it may benefit you to go back and listen to the earlier videos, but in case you don't want to or in case you need a refresher, I was raised in a fundamentalist Christian cult which I left when I was in my late teens. Shortly after I left the cult I joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormon Church. And I wasn't in the Mormon Church long before I served a full-time 2-year mission for the church. On my mission, I learned some things about the church that caused me to doubt, but I put those things on my shelf. And I focused on being the best missionary I could possibly be. After my mission, I started taking a critical look at a few of the things on my shelf and adding more things to the shelf, and the weight was causing the shelf to bow. In college, I learned many things that challenged my worldview, including the theory of evolution and critical thinking skills that caused me to reevaluate everything that I was ever taught to see if they could stand on their own merits. As a result of critically examining almost everything I was taught, I changed my view on a lot of things. But one thing that I was unwilling to look at too critically was the church, because I knew that looking past the mark caused people to go astray. And at the time, the thought of leaving the church terrified me. Regardless of how much I needed and wanted to believe in the church, though, some things were not adding up, and I was having an increasingly difficult time overlooking them. After a few years of college, I joined the U.S. Navy, but I wasn't in the service long as I was caught sleepwalking and was given a medical discharge. While in the Navy, just before I got discharged, I attempted suicide because I felt like a failure for not being able to make it in the Navy, and because of the depression caused by my past trauma. My faith was weak before I joined the Navy, and in some ways, my time in the Navy strengthened my testimony and caused me to stay in the church. Before I go on with my story, I want to address a question that I have been getting a lot, and that is about where my mother fits into my story. My mother, while far from perfect, was the best mother she could have been with the tools that were available to her, and we still have a good relationship today. My mother joined the church shortly after I did, but like me, she is no longer a part of the church. Though it's not my place to speak as to why my mother left the church, that's her story to tell. After the Navy, I was no longer actively thinking about leaving the church, but I still struggled with my faith, and I was only partially active, attending sacrament meeting a few times a month. At the time, I drove the city bus, and a college student named Rachel, obviously not her real name, rode my bus almost every day, and we became friends. One day, after a few weeks of talking, Rachel asked me out, and I agreed to go out with her. It wasn't long before we were in a committed relationship. There were so many red flags that they looked like confetti, but I wanted the relationship to succeed, so I ignored them. Even though I wasn't sure how I felt about the church, I wanted to make sure that I was dating someone who I could possibly take to the temple one day. So even though Rachel was completely inactive and held some large-scale animosity toward the church, I asked if she would be opposed to a temple marriage, and she said that she always wanted to get married in the temple. After a short time, Rachel started attending my ward with me and regained some, however slight, interest in the church. Rachel and I hadn't dated long before people started pressuring us to get married, and we decided to follow the admonition of the church and get married as soon as we could so that we wouldn't fall into temptation and have any sexual relationships outside of marriage. Which, by the way, at this point I want to point out something that the church says that is problematic. The church says that any two people who are living the gospel can have a happy marriage. That doesn't matter how different you are from each other. If the church is the most important thing in your life, that you can have a happy marriage, and that is not true. So, anyhow, since Rachel wasn't worthy to hold the temple of recommend at the time that we got married, we had to get married civilly with a plan to be sealed in the temple a year later. Despite my best efforts to be good and to follow the teachings of the church, we eventually fell to temptation and we sinned before we got married, which didn't bother Rachel since she held a great deal of anger toward the church for how it, or at least some of its members, had treated her previously. As the wedding approached, I had a harder time ignoring all of the red flags, and I almost backed out of the wedding, but it felt like I was trapped, and I went through with it, partially out of obligation and partially because I was deeply depressed and felt that I would never find anything better or even that good. You know, depression lies to you like that. And it's like it was said on The Perks of Being a Wallflower. We wind up with people who are no good for us because we accept the love we think we deserve. I'm sure Rachel saw a lot of red flags as well and ignored those. And in retrospect, we never should have gotten married. Despite practically hating the church when we were dating, as soon as we got married, Rachel became extremely zealous about the church, even to the point of becoming self-righteous and judging her parents for not being good enough members. I had no idea why Rachel made such a drastic change in her opinion on the church, but I did know that even though I had doubts that predated our relationship, my doubts were no longer welcome, and I would have to do my best to believe in the church for the sake of the relationship. Rachel and I talked to our bishop and repented, and it wasn't long before we had temple recommends. And after about a year, we got married. After about a year after we got married, we got sealed in the Idaho Falls Temple. I still had my doubts, though, but I did my best to ignore them, and I did my best to not let Rachel know I was doubting. After a while, my doubts plagued me to the point where I went inactive, and Rachel went inactive with me, but that was the last time that she allowed me to express my doubts without repercussion. We were only inactive a short time before I decided to give the church another chance and completely rededicated myself to it. I still had doubts, of course I did, but I did my best to ignore them. After a while, I got a job where I had to work on Sundays, and I was glad because it meant that I didn't have to attend church, and Rachel couldn't be mad at me because I was the only one of us who was bringing in any money into the home. Rachel and my mother didn't get along very well, and they both tried to pull me into their fights, which was a nightmare, and I did my best to stay out of it. Eventually, Rachel decided that she wanted to move out of state so we wouldn't be close to my family, and we moved to Nebraska, 2 states away. Rachel would visit her sister a lot, and whenever she did, she would come back mad at me and mad that I had doubts in the church, even though her sister hadn't attended church in years and hated the church. Somehow it was okay for her sister to have misgivings about the church, but my doubts made me a bad person. For a while, I was fairly good at keeping my doubts to myself so we didn't argue about them, but that wasn't healthy, and whenever something came up, we would argue about it. I did a lot of research into the church from church sources to try to grow my faith, but it had a deleterious effect on my faith instead. I even went to the temple to pray for more faith, but to no avail. One of the things that caused me a lot of doubt was the fact that the Book of Mormon unequivocally claims that the Native Americans are descended from Jewish population, when all available evidence says that they have no Semitic genetics at all. It bothered me that the Book of Mormon had so many anachronisms, such as the existence of horses, cattle, and other animals in the Americas at the time that they did not exist here. The Book of Mormon has the inhabitants of America using steel long before it was discovered, and not only that, but there is no evidence that steel was ever smelted in the Americas before the Spanish came over. The Book of Mormon mentions crops and animals that did not exist in the America during any of the time span that the Book of Mormon covers, while the crops and animals that did exist in the Americas at that time are strangely absent from mention in the book. Among the many other problems with the Book of Mormon is the supposed Jewish population living more like the Christians of the 1800s than that of Jews. Since the Book of Mormon claims to be the most correct book on earth and the foundation of the church, it should be free from any major errors, while it is plagued with many, many errors, such as having the incorrect translation of some Bible verses. I loved the Book of Mormon, and I'd read it countless times, but I could not overlook its flaws. I had always been taught an idealized version of Joseph Smith, where he was nearly perfect, and that he had only had one wife. So when I found out that he was a fundamentally flawed man, and that he actually had up to 40 wives, some of which were young teenage girls, and some of which had living husbands at the time he married them, it caused me a lot of doubt. The blatant and open racism of Brigham Young also caused me a lot of doubt. People always told me that I could not judge the church based on the flaws of its leaders. But the Doctrine and Covenants says that a prophet can never lead the church astray. In the official Declaration 1, President Wilford Woodruff says, "The Lord will never permit me or any other man who stands as president of the church to lead you astray. It is not in the program. It is not in the mind of God. If I were to attempt that, the Lord would have removed me out of my place. And so he will with any other man who attempts to lead the children of men astray from the oracles of God and from their duty. Even though it is official doctrine that the prophet cannot lead the church astray, many of the problematic things that were said by past prophets were spoken from the pulpit, and the prophet was not removed as promised in the Doctrine and Covenants. So therefore, either the Doctrine and Covenants is wrong, or what the prophet said is the will of the church and should not be apologized for, or a third and far more likely option, the entire church is a sham. I left the church long before the CES letters or the letter to my wife came out. And though I did leave for many of the same issues addressed in those documents. Apparently, I was not the only one to find aspects of the church deeply problematic. With all of my doubts, it became quickly apparent that I would either have to pretend I believed in the church or live a lie, or else my marriage would end. I knew for an absolute fact that Rachel would not allow me to live true to myself and remain in the marriage if living true to myself meant that I was to leave the church. For a while, I thought I could live happily pretending to believe in order to save my marriage. But the cognitive dissonance was tearing me up, and I realized that I had to be true to myself regardless of the cost. Friedrich Nietzsche said, "The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will be lonely often, and sometimes frightened. But no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself." I found out for myself that the price of owning yourself is high indeed. I prayed with real intent to know the church was true, but my prayers fell on deaf or non-existent ears, and I never got an answer. If the church is true, then God did not want me to believe in it, because he knew exactly what it would take to get me to believe in it, yet simply ignored my fervent, heartfelt prayers. After months of praying, I gave up and decided to leave the church, and a matter of weeks later I was going through a divorce, and most of my friends had jumped ship. I think it's important to point out that I'm in no way saying the failure of my marriage is the fault of my ex-wife alone, and I fully admit that I contributed to the failure as well. Simply put, we had a lot of issues in the marriage, but the church was the largest, and when all was said and done, Rachel didn't love me enough to stay with me if I left the church, and I didn't love her enough to live the rest of my life in a lie. Around this time, I joined a local atheist group and made a lot of new friends. And I spent a lot of my time trying to prove religion, especially Christianity, was wrong. But after a few years, I was no longer angry at religion, and I was happy to just not believe. In the next part of my story, I want to talk about why I started attending church again and how that turned out. Thanks for listening to my story, and hopefully it has helped you in some way. Feel free to comment, just be nice about it, or don't, you're an adult. If you haven't done so already, go ahead and subscribe so you won't miss any of my future videos. And if you haven't watched the rest of this series already, I think it would be highly beneficial for you to do so. And if you got anything out of this video, don't forget to hit that like button to show your love and support. Again, thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next video.